It was one of those lazy Saturday mornings when the air smelled like damp soil and fresh coffee. I was out on the balcony, watering my plants, my small jungle of ferns and succulents that somehow felt more loyal than most people I knew. The courtyard buzzed softly below me. Kids laughing, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the comforting hum of weekend life. Then, out of nowhere, I heard Mrs. Parker's cheerful voice cutting through the stillness. "Elena, you're such a lucky woman," she called, waving from her garden hat like the sweet neighbor she'd always been. I smiled back, clueless about the sting hiding behind her words. When I asked her why, she beamed. "Your husband, always so helpful. I see him carrying groceries for that young lady from 402 almost every other day. Such a gentleman." For a second, I froze. The watering can tilted, cold water spilling over my fingers. Every other day? I forced a polite laugh, but something in my chest tightened. Mrs. Parker kept talking, blissfully unaware of the tiny earthquake she'd just triggered. "She's lucky to have a neighbor like him," she added, her voice fading into the morning breeze. "The woman from 402? I repeated, pretending to sound casual. Mrs. Parker nodded, smiling like she was sharing good news. "Yes, lovely girl. Always in those short dresses." That phrase, short dresses, echoed in my mind like a dripping faucet I couldn't turn off. I smiled again, but it felt wrong. Inside, something sharp twisted. Groceries, every other day. Funny. We barely even shop that often, and that's when it started, the first crack in the picture-perfect frame of my marriage. For the rest of that morning, I tried to shake it off. Really, I did. I repotted a fern, swept the balcony, even called my sister just to talk about nothing. But no matter what I did, Mrs. Parker's words kept looping in my head like an annoying song I couldn't stop humming. Every other day. I replayed it again and again. Tom wasn't the grocery type. He hated crowds, hated waiting in line. So why would he suddenly turn into the building's volunteer bellboy? By lunchtime, my mind had built 1,000 tiny theories, each one more ridiculous than the last. Maybe the woman was old. Maybe she was sick. Maybe he was just being kind. That's what I told myself as I set the table. But deep down, a voice I didn't want to hear whispered, "You already know, don't you?" That small, quiet voice had never lied to me before. I kept smiling, humming to fill the silence, but my stomach churned with unease I couldn't name. When Tom finally came home that afternoon, carrying his usual easy smile, I studied him like a stranger. He kissed my cheek, dropped his keys in the bowl, and asked about dinner, completely unaware that my entire perception of him had shifted an inch. I told myself not to overthink, that one innocent comment from a neighbor couldn't undo years of marriage. But the truth, it already had. The seed of doubt was planted, and I could feel it rooting deep, even as I smiled and said, "Everything's fine." That night, while Tom watched TV in the living room, I stood in the kitchen pretending to wipe down the counter that was already spotless. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between us, and every sound, his laugh, the rustle of a chip bag, suddenly felt foreign. I caught myself staring at his reflection in the dark window, wondering how many other versions of him existed outside the one I thought I knew. Mrs. Parker's voice echoed again in my head. Such a gentleman. It felt less like a compliment now and more like a warning. I poured myself a glass of wine, even though it was barely past 6. The first sip burned, but it calmed the storm building behind my ribs. I thought about that woman, the one from 402, and tried to picture her face. I couldn't. All I saw were flashes, a short dress, a fake smile, someone laughing too loudly at something Tom said. The kind of laughter that used to be mine, the kind that meant something. My throat tightened, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Women like me always try to rationalize the unease away, until it's too loud to ignore. Before bed, I looked at Tom one last time as he scrolled through his phone, the screen's glow painting his face blue. He looked calm, ordinary, like the man I'd promised forever to. But deep down, something had shifted. A small fracture that wouldn't stay hidden for long. I didn't know it yet, but Mrs. Parker's innocent compliment had just rewritten everything. The next time I'd bring it up, it wouldn't be small talk anymore. That evening over dinner, I decided to bring it up, carefully, like handling glass that could shatter with the wrong word. The smell of roasted garlic and tomatoes filled the kitchen, the kind of comforting scent that used to mean safety, love, routine. Tom sat across from me, twirling his pasta, oblivious. I smiled as if nothing had changed, but my pulse was beating faster than it should have. I picked at my food and said casually, "Mrs. Parker mentioned you've been helping someone from the 4th floor. Carrying groceries?" He barely looked up. "Oh yeah, the woman from 402, Mia, I think. She's new, lives alone, just being polite." Just being polite. He said it like it meant nothing, like those words were enough to stop every doubt from growing, but they didn't. I smiled, pretending I hadn't noticed the way his shoulders tensed or how he didn't meet my eyes. "Polite every day?" I asked lightly, twirling my fork. He chuckled, but it came out sharp, defensive, the kind of laugh that hides something. "You know how these buildings are," he said, suddenly louder. "Old elevator, heavy bags. What, you think I shouldn't help people anymore?" The tone, that shift, hit me like cold water. My fork stopped midair. I wanted to say that's not what I meant, but part of me was afraid of confirming what my gut already screamed. Instead, I smiled again, a reflex more than a choice. "Just curious," I said softly. "Didn't realize chivalry came with a daily schedule." He scoffed and changed the subject, but his reaction said everything he didn't. After dinner, the silence between us felt heavier than the plates I carried to the sink. The clinking of cutlery became my excuse not to speak. He hummed a tune from the living room, like everything was normal, but every note grated against me. I could still feel that flicker of anger in his tone, the way his eyes had darkened for a split second when I'd said, "every day." It wasn't guilt I recognized, but fear, the kind that hides behind practiced calm. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Later that night, he showered while I folded laundry in the bedroom. The soft hiss of water was the only sound between us. My hands moved automatically, shirt, towel, socks, but my mind was racing. What if Mrs. Parker was wrong? What if I was wrong? Still, the image of him carrying those grocery bags, smiling that same polite smile, haunted me. It wasn't about the bags anymore. It was about the lie I could already feel forming between us, invisible but thick as fog. When he came out of the bathroom, smelling of soap and comfort I no longer trusted, I smiled up at him. He leaned down, kissed my forehead, and said, "You worry too much." My heart twisted, because he wasn't wrong. I did worry too much. But maybe that's what kept me from being blindsided. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, the sound of his breathing too steady, too rehearsed. I knew I wouldn't find peace until I found the truth. When the house finally fell silent, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The glow from his phone charger lit the nightstand, that soft blue light that had become our third companion. I hesitated for a second, guilt pressing against my chest. But then I remembered his tone at dinner, the defensiveness, the sudden anger. Love doesn't sound like that. I reached for his phone, my hands trembling just enough to make the screen blur when I unlocked it. I didn't have to search far. There it was, a contact named Mia 402. Simple, harmless, if only it felt that way. The message thread was mostly empty, just a few lines. Most had been deleted, probably after he thought I'd gone to bed. But one message remained, hanging there like a confession written in pixels. "Thanks again for helping. I owe you one." My stomach dropped. The wink, that tiny, smug symbol, was enough to make everything click into place. I suddenly hated how quiet the apartment felt. I locked the phone, slipped it back, and lay beside him, pretending to sleep. His breathing was deep, steady, like a man who had nothing to hide. I stared at the ceiling again, this time with tears that wouldn't fall. Mrs. Parker's compliment had turned into confirmation, and all I could think was how easily trust can fracture. how something as small as a wink can burn a hole through a marriage. I closed my eyes, knowing morning would come, and with it, a plan. By Tuesday, I couldn't stand pretending anymore. Every word out of his mouth felt rehearsed, every smile like a performance for an audience of one, me. So I decided to test the story myself. I told him I'd left my purse at work and would be home late. "Don't wait up," I said lightly, kissing his cheek as if nothing was wrong. He smiled, oblivious, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. That's the thing about betrayal. Once you suspect it, you stop fearing it. You start planning for it. I parked my car a few buildings away, far enough that he wouldn't notice it when he came home. The sun was setting, painting the sky with that cruel kind of beauty that only makes pain feel sharper. I waited. The minutes stretched like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. At 6:45, I saw him. He was carrying grocery bags, like Mrs. Parker said, but he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, laughing softly, brushing her hair behind her ear as if the world belonged to her. Even from a distance, I knew. The way she touched his arm, the way he leaned in, it wasn't politeness, it was intimacy dressed as convenience. She held a bottle of wine. He smiled the smile that used to be mine. I felt something inside me twist, not in heartbreak, but in quiet fury. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I just whispered to myself, "Let's see how polite you'll be when I'm done with you." And for the first time in weeks, I actually meant every word. I stayed there in the car, frozen but aware of every heartbeat. My hands were steady now, almost unnervingly calm, like my body understood something my heart was still catching up to. They disappeared into the building together, the automatic door sliding open with a whisper that felt like betrayal itself. I could picture the rest without seeing it, the laughter, the wine being poured, the soft music he'd probably chosen to set the mood. Funny how I used to think I knew every corner of his honesty. Turns out, I only knew the parts he let me see. For nearly an hour, I sat in silence, watching windows light up across the complex. One by one, people's lives came alive. Dinners, TV shows, children arguing about bedtime. And there I was, parked in the shadows, waiting for my own life to come crashing down. My phone buzzed at exactly 8:20 p.m. I stared at the screen before opening it. His name glowed across the top. Tom. The message read, "Just finished dinner, watching TV. You home soon?" I stared at it for a long moment, then smiled. Not sadly, but sharply. He was lying in real time, weaving stories while his truth sat a few floors up with him, wrapped in a red dress and a bottle of wine. I typed back, "Not yet. Got stuck finishing some things. You?" He replied within seconds, "Same here. Love you." That last line, "love you," hit me like a cruel joke. I whispered it back to myself, but this time it tasted different. Bitter, hollow, and final. I stayed there until the bottle of water beside me turned warm and the streetlights flickered to life. The world outside felt still, but inside me something was shifting, not breaking, not crumbling, but rearranging. The kind of stillness that comes before a decision. I wasn't the woman crying in the car, waiting for answers. I was the woman collecting evidence, connecting dots, preparing for the moment he'd wish he'd never underestimated me. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes, it whispers. When the apartment lights finally went dark, I started the car and drove home, the tires humming a low, steady rhythm that matched the new beat of my pulse. As I parked in our usual spot, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Calm eyes, no mascara streaks, just quiet purpose. It was strange, almost comforting. I wasn't planning chaos. I was planning clarity. And clarity, I decided, would be my weapon. When I stepped inside, Tom was already on the couch, yawning, remote in hand. "Long day?" he asked, smiling like the perfect husband. "You have no idea," I said, hanging my coat. I leaned down, kissed his cheek gently. Not because I wanted to, but because it would make what came next so much sweeter. He smelled faintly of wine. Not ours, not tonight's. And as I poured myself a glass of water, my mind was already writing tomorrow's scene, the one where he'd learn what it feels like to be blindsided. The next morning, I woke up with a strange kind of peace. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just clarity. I brewed coffee like always, humming to myself as if nothing had changed. Tom kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work, and I smiled, thinking how easily liars rely on routine to keep their masks in place. But I wasn't the same woman he'd kissed goodnight. Not anymore. I had seen enough. Now, it was time for him to see something too. What it looks like when the quiet wife stops pretending. By mid-morning, I'd made up my mind. I wanted to look her in the eye, the woman from 402. I wanted to see what kind of person drinks wine with another woman's husband and still sleeps at night. So I baked muffins, the polite kind of peace offering that hides the sharpest intentions, and knocked on her door. When she opened it, her face froze for half a second before rearranging itself into a smile. She was pretty, I'll give her that. Young, nervous, dressed too perfectly for a lazy weekday morning. "Hi," I said warmly. "I'm Elena, Tom's wife." For a split second, the color drained from her face. She recovered quickly, though. Liars often do. "Oh, hi. He mentioned you," she stammered, clutching the door handle like it might save her. I handed her the muffins, keeping my tone light. "I just wanted to officially welcome you to the building," I said sweetly. Her eyes darted, calculating whether this was friendliness or fire. She couldn't tell yet. That's the thing about masks. They work both ways. We sat at her little breakfast table, sunlight spilling across the room like an accomplice. She poured coffee with shaky hands, trying to act casual, but her nervous laughter gave her away. "Tom's been such a help," she said quickly, as if naming him might fill the silence. "With the groceries and all?" I smiled, stirring my cup slowly. "Yes, he's very helpful, isn't he?" I let the words linger, sweet on the outside, sharp underneath. "Mrs. Parker mentioned you two spend quite a bit of time together. Wine nights, too, I hear." Her eyes widened, the way a cornered animal looks for the nearest escape. "Oh, that's just, he's been so kind. We, talk sometimes." I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hand. "Talk," I repeated softly. "With wine, in my apartment, at night?" The words landed gently, but they hit like a slap. She froze, her lips parting but no sound coming out. The silence stretched, the kind that swallows every excuse before it's spoken. I could have screamed, could have thrown the coffee cup just to watch it shatter, but instead I smiled. "Relax, Mia," I said quietly. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to warn you." She blinked, confused. I lowered my voice. "He's done this before. He'll do it again. Just make sure when he falls, you're not standing under him." She stared at me, speechless, her coffee untouched. I stood, brushed imaginary crumbs from my skirt, and said, "Thanks for the chat." Her lips trembled as I walked away, and for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt in control. That evening, I set the table like it was our anniversary. Candles, pasta, wine, soft music. Tom walked in, loosened his tie, and smiled. "What's the occasion?" he asked, kissing my cheek. "Just us," I said, and the words tasted like justice. We ate, laughed a little, pretended to be normal. He poured himself another glass, talking about work like his world wasn't about to crumble. I waited until his plate was empty before pulling out my phone, pressing play. The sound of Mia's trembling voice filled the room. "She told me everything," I said calmly, watching the blood drain from his face. "About the groceries, the wine, the lies." He set his fork down, staring at me like I'd just turned into someone else. Maybe I had. "It's not what you think," he stammered. I tilted my head, almost amused. "Then tell me what it is, because the building's security cameras make it look exactly like what I think." His jaw tightened. Silence. That kind of silence you can hear break. "Good," I said finally, leaning back. Because I already sent the footage to HR. Affairs between colleagues don't look great on a resume, do they? His eyes widened, panic mixing with disbelief. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For once, Tom had no story left to tell. I stood, collecting the plates with steady hands, while he sat there, the great pretender stripped bare at his own table. And as the candlelight flickered between us, I realized something. Revenge doesn't heal, but it does cleanse. And tonight, I was spotless. The days that followed felt strangely peaceful, like walking through the ruins of a city you once called home. The noise was gone, the chaos too, and all that remained was silence. Tom barely spoke to me after that night. He slept on the couch, pretended to make calls that never came, and paced the apartment like a ghost searching for the life he'd destroyed. I watched it all unfold from a distance, detached, almost curious. When HR called him in that Friday, I already knew what the outcome would be. You can't charm your way out of a lie when the evidence wears your name. By Monday, he was jobless. The official reason? Policy violation and dishonesty. The real reason? Me. I'd never realized how calm vengeance could feel. Not fiery, not loud, just certain. He begged me to talk, but what was left to say? Every word between us had already expired. You ruined my career, he said one night, his voice trembling with self-pity. I looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing. No, Tom, I said softly. You ruined our marriage. I just made it official. He flinched at that, like the truth itself had slapped him. Maybe it did. He muttered something about mistakes, about not meaning to hurt me. I almost laughed. You didn't mean to get caught, I said, and the words came out colder than I expected. For a moment, I thought he'd yell. But he didn't. He just looked small, deflated, like the man who once filled every corner of my world had finally shrunk to fit the truth I'd always feared. He was never that big to begin with. When he finally packed his things, I watched from the doorway, not to make sure he left, but to remind myself that I was staying. He shoved his clothes into a duffel bag, muttering about second chances, about how people make mistakes. I stayed silent, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. Once his apologies would have broken me wide open. Now they barely scratched the surface. It was almost poetic. He'd spent years building a life on my trust, and I dismantled it in 1 week with my silence. He stopped by the door, suitcase in hand, eyes glassy. You'll regret this, he said, his voice shaking more from fear than anger. I tilted my head, studying him the way you'd study a stranger who vaguely resembles someone you used to love. No, I said softly. I already regret believing you. That shut him up. He nodded once, maybe out of pride, maybe because there was nothing left to say. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a sound that didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. For a long moment, I stood in the quiet, listening to the echo fade. I half expected to collapse, to sob, to crumble the way women in movies do after heartbreak. But none of that came. Instead, I walked to the window, opened it wide, and let the night air rush in. It smelled like rain and release, like freedom. That's when I realized the real fall wasn't his. It was mine, months ago, when I'd started believing a version of love that demanded my blindness. But now, I was done falling. After he left, the apartment felt too big, too clean, too silent. But it was my silence now, not the kind that hides secrets, the kind that heals. I walked through each room, touching things that suddenly felt lighter without his shadow draped over them. The couch where he used to sit, the table where we'd laughed, the doorway where we'd argued, all of it still existed, but the energy had changed. It was no longer ours. It was mine. And that simple shift, that ownership of space and peace, felt better than any apology ever could. In the days that followed, I found new rhythms. Mornings with coffee and open windows, evenings spent reading instead of waiting. I started cooking meals just for me, small, simple, imperfect. I even caught myself humming again. It wasn't happiness yet, not fully, but it was peace, wearing happiness's perfume. I learned that revenge doesn't fill the empty spaces. It just clears them out, giving you room to rebuild something real. One evening, I stood on the balcony, watching the city lights blink in and out like a heartbeat. Somewhere out there, he was probably blaming me, rewriting the story to make himself the victim. Let him. The truth didn't need defending anymore. I'd lived it, survived it, and now I was rewriting my own version. One without lies, one where I didn't wait for love to prove itself. And as the wind brushed against my skin, I whispered to no one in particular, I'm free. Months later, life had a new rhythm. Slower, softer, honest. I'd moved to a small apartment near the beach, the kind of place where mornings start with sea breeze and end with peace. The walls were white, the furniture simple, and for the first time in years, nothing in my home reminded me of someone else. I'd traded shared chaos for quiet independence, and it suited me. Saturday mornings became my favorite again. Farmers markets, fresh flowers, small talk with strangers who didn't know my history. That's where I saw her, Mrs. Parker, standing by a stall of oranges, the same gentle smile, the same sparkle of gossip in her eyes. "Elena, dear," she called out, waving as if no time had passed. "How are you? Still married to that helpful husband of yours?" I laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes from the gut, unfiltered and free. "Oh, no," I said, picking up a bag of peaches. I stopped sharing him with the neighbors. Her laughter rang out, warm and approving. "Good for you," she said, patting my arm. "Some lessons take longer than they should." As we talked, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a shop window, sun-kissed, calm, whole. I looked like someone I used to know but hadn't seen in a long time. The version of me before doubt, before deception. And in that moment, I realized, it wasn't just Tom I'd let go of. It was the version of myself that kept waiting to be chosen. Now I was doing the choosing, in every small, quiet, beautiful way. Mrs. Parker and I walked through the market together, baskets swinging at our sides, the scent of fresh bread and lavender floating in the air. She told me about her new cat, her grandkids, and the neighbor who borrowed her ladder and never returned it. Ordinary things. Beautifully ordinary. And for once, I wasn't listening for subtext. No hidden meanings, no warnings disguised as compliments. Just two women talking, safe in the simple space of honesty. I hadn't realized how much peace could hide inside normalcy. When we parted ways, she hugged me, the kind of hug that feels like closure wrapped in warmth. "You look happy, dear," she said. Lighter. I smiled, adjusting the strap of my grocery bag. "I am," I said honestly. "It took me a while, but I finally learned how to carry things on my own." She nodded knowingly, the way only women who've lived and loved long enough truly understand. Then she winked. "Good. But don't carry too much. Leave room for something better." As I walked home, her words lingered, weaving into the hum of the ocean breeze. The bag in my hand felt heavier than usual, but not in a bad way. It was the weight of a life that finally belonged to me. Each step felt deliberate, grounded. I wasn't hurrying toward anyone or away from anything. For the first time in years, I was simply walking home, to myself. Back home, I set the groceries on the counter, sunlight streaming through the open window. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and freedom, my two favorite scents now. I unpacked the peaches, the bread, the small bouquet of wildflowers I hadn't planned to buy but couldn't resist. The place was quiet, but not empty. It was alive with the kind of silence that feels earned. I poured myself a glass of wine, raised it toward the window, and whispered, "Here's to starting over." It hit me then, how something as ordinary as grocery bags could hold an entire story. They used to remind me of lies, his lies, the ones wrapped in politeness and errands. But now they were just bags again, filled with things I chose, carried by hands that didn't tremble anymore. Healing wasn't a grand moment. It was this. Groceries on the counter, laughter still echoing from the market, the faint hum of the ocean outside my window. Ordinary peace. Extraordinary relief. And as I leaned against the counter, smiling at nothing in particular, I heard my own voice, calm and sure, as if narrating the final scene of a life rewritten. He used to carry other women's bags. Now I carry my own, and that's lighter than anything he ever gave me.